You've heard the horror stories about the patient who goes into the hospital and has the wrong arm or leg chopped off, but you may not be aware of the growing recognition of the problem of doctors and nurses who murder their patients. Today, Bea Yorker is here. She's Dean of the College of Health and Human Services at Cal State LA. She's author of a study that's found that thousands of patients have been killed by dozens of healthcare workers in recent years. Pleasure to have you here today, Bea.
Thank you.
And I want to say, you hear about crooked cops or firemen who start fires, but this really somehow seems worse because you're talking about healthcare workers, doctors and nurses, who supposedly are devoting their lives to saving patients, but instead are murdering their patients.
Yes, it's really eroded the public trust. Whenever one of these cases happens, family members who've lost a loved one, often under suspicious circumstances, but they're dealing with their grief. Then when they realize there are murder charges and that a number of patients have died at the hands of this doctor or nurse, it really delays the grieving process and it does erode the trust in the hospital.
And I just want to make it clear, I mean, we're not talking malpractice or mercy killings. I mean, these are people who are serial killers.
It is not an accident, and although some of the killers have said when they've been caught, they've said, oh, I was only trying to help the patients, it turns out
Meaning
that,
put them out of their misery?
Exactly, put them out of their misery. They try to pretend that it was euthanasia, but when we look at the medical records, we find out that maybe the patient was admitted for a biopsy and it turned out to be negative. The difference between euthanasia and the serial killing is that, say, Jack Kevorkian, he got full informed consent from the patients and from their families.
I think it was like videotaped or something even?
I'm sure he did, yeah. So, none of the patients who've died at the hands of a serial killer gave any kind of informed consent to their death. They did not particularly ask to be put out of their misery.
I thought it was interesting that despite the thousands of cases that you uncovered in your search, you really kind of limited the field because you excluded single murders.
Right.
You were just looking at serial killers. You didn't look at mercy killings, as we said. I think you also excluded Hurricane Katrina.
We did. There is right now a murder investigation in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, but we felt that the doctors and nurses were operating under extreme circumstances, and whatever the outcome is, we did not feel that they had the same motives as the killers that we've studied.
Do you have any thoughts on what they did, even if you decided not to include them in your study? Or
in Katrina?
Right.
This is speculation. I think that they felt that if help wasn't coming, that it would be better for patients to die peacefully with medications such as morphine or painkillers than to die in misery from dehydration or from respiratory failure from just lack of care.
So you really do look at it from the mercy killing point of view, or the...
I think that in Katrina, if it turns out that the patients were toxically overdosed and that's what caused their death, then I believe that the motives were very humane.
Now, I believe there were a couple of investigations there, one for the hospital and one for the nursing home as well.
Right.
So do you think both cases the motive was equally benevolent, if you will? Or?
I do.
Okay. But as we know, so as I say, you're excluding those kind of extraordinary situations. Also doctors and nurses who may have killed loved ones or domestic violence or all kinds of things. But even then, you've come across, what did you find? How many cases? What are we talking?
Well, we have 90 legal prosecutions worldwide. Most of these have occurred in first world countries where there's high-tech healthcare and where people have statistics on patient deaths. So,
meaning the United States?
The United States has just about half of the 90 prosecutions. 54 of the 90 have been convicted. Another 25 are waiting because their prosecution, it takes years sometimes to prosecute these cases, so some are waiting. Some of them were acquitted of murder because there was not enough evidence. It takes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a lot of evidence to convict somebody for murder. And some of them, some of the legal prosecutions just ended up with the judge saying, you didn't make your case. You don't have enough evidence here.
Wow. So what does that mean? Are they still out there killing?
Well, In some cases, there were civil suits against them. They may not have been convicted for murder, but when the patients' families sued the hospital, they'd get millions of dollars in awards for wrongful death because it was obvious in the cases where they had statistical evidence. So one nurse in Maryland was found to be 57 times more likely to have patients in her care die. And
yeah, I saw that in the study.
That is startling, but that's not enough to send you to prison for the rest of your life.
Not enough.
Statistics is not enough.
Because I guess for criminal cases where it's beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt, that's not a high enough standard. Whereas for civil suits, where it's preponderance of the evidence, is what you say in the study.
That's right. 57 times more likely to have your patients die. That's enough to
you can
have a
sue
preponderance.
him and get some money,
That's
kind of like
right.
the O.J. Simpson thing, where they couldn't prove murder, but they sued him later for money.
Exactly.
And so, but again, you're talking thousands of people. So in the U.S.
Well, the patients, the body count is over 2,000. It's like 2,100 plus or minus. There's still a case pending in Poland that could raise that number to huge amounts. There's an investigation where several nurses and doctors are being investigated for getting financial kickbacks from a funeral home, and there may be as many as 5,000
wow, that
patients.
is just unbelievable.
There's, in the article I read, sometimes when the ambulance was called, it was paramedics and doctors and nurses, they'd pick up a patient, they wouldn't even stop at the hospital. They'd inject them with a muscle relaxant that caused them to stop breathing, and they'd just drive right to the funeral parlor.
Oh my God. So even the emergency workers were involved.
Oh yeah.
As far as, wow.
Yeah, so it's a big scheme.
And how, I mean, how does something like, how long did that go on?
Apparently for some years.
Years.
Yeah. But excluding that huge number of victims, we're looking at between 2 and 200 victims per convicted healthcare provider. Yeah.
And the thing is, often I think, right, they only really get charged with a fraction of those, or they may only, in other words, they get charged with 12, or maybe they think they did 100, but they don't really know. I mean, they suspect that the number could be higher than whatever they're prosecuted for.
That's correct. Because the prosecutors, it's very hard to prove these cases. You have to get post-mortem, which is after death, toxicology screens, and look for some drug that may have completely disappeared from the system. So the prosecutors will figure out which are the strongest one or few deaths to go for a murder conviction. Wow. But then when you look at the data, you'll see that many other patients died suspiciously while in the care of that nurse.
Wow. And so thousands over, we're talking, what, a 35-year period is what you studied?
35, 36, 37, yeah. Since 1970, we've been collecting the data. And there was a gap between not much really, no convictions, 1970 previously. But then when we look historically, it seems that doctors and nurses have been killing patients, and just for sadistic or power reasons, back into the 1800s. Yeah, there's some anecdotal cases in the literature.
And it was probably harder to track back then. I
Yes,
would think
it
in a way
was.
because, you know, at the house calls with a doctor and no, you don't have quality assurance, or, you know, I mean, all of those things that you have in a big, certainly academic institution, you know, where teams of people are supervising everything.
And you're onto that, because quality assurance, we think, is one, why it's been detected, and two, the best way to deter people from doing that is if they know that the records are being tracked of patient deaths, if they know that they might be statistically associated with an increase in patient deaths, we want to encourage hospitals to do good quality assurance and good risk management.
Sure. Well, we'll be right back in just a minute, and when we come back, I want to just find out, you know, how they get away with it, because it's just mind-boggling. We're back with Bea Yorker today talking about serial killers operating in hospitals, doctors and nurses of all things. Well, before we get into the subject of how they get away with it, I also want to say that outside the U.S., I believe you said it's Germany and England that tend to have bigger concentrations of this as well, right?
Yeah, Germany has 15 cases. They've had 2 pop up since we were collecting the data and getting this article to press. England has 13. Italy has 1. Egypt has 1. Japan has 3. So, and then several other European countries. Belgium has had quite a few, the Netherlands. So
now, I believe the worst case of all time was in England?
Well, Harold Shipman was a physician, and he's charged with killing 218 of his patients over a 3-decade career. And he killed them in their homes. He killed them sometimes in his physician's office and sometimes in the hospital.
Now, how do you kill 218 patients over 30 years and get away with it?
The British government and the healthcare system have done an exhaustive inquisition and investigation into how that could have happened. And that's similar to the Charles Cullen case in the United States. He was a nurse who worked in 2 different states, in 9 hospitals and a nursing home. And he confessed to killing over 40 patients in a 16-year career. And the big question was, how could he possibly have been able to go from one hospital to another? And you know, people did try to investigate. They knew something was suspicious, but they just had a hard time getting enough hard evidence to violate his civil rights by denying him his license to practice and by actually, you know, incarcerating him and trying him. Of course, finally, there was enough evidence, but it took 16 years.
I remember that case too when it was in the news, and I didn't realize how much of a larger problem it's a part of. But so I'll turn that question around, and instead of saying how did they get away with it, how did they finally catch him?
Well, luckily, nurses are often the whistleblowers. It's their healthcare professional peers. And in an England case, there was a small little rural hospital that had a very small pediatric unit, maybe 10 beds, and they had maybe 2 codes a year. They hired a new nurse. She was fresh out of nursing school, and in 6 weeks they had 24 codes.
Oh my God.
So the doctors where these babies were being rushed to intensive care and to, you know, the sort of urban hospital, the doctors said, you've got to investigate this hospital. Something terrible is going on there that all these babies are having codes. Other ways are the statistical analysis. If you've got good risk management and then all of a sudden you notice that you're having an epidemic of suspicious patient deaths on a single shift, like on the evening shift or on the night shift, which is the shifts that most of these happen to occur.
So at night is when it happens, because not as much supervision, not as many people around.
Right, exactly. So sometimes it's just by looking at trends in the data. And one of the interesting ways that nurses get caught is after a code, after they've been injected with a substance that either causes their heart to stop or their breathing to stop. In New York, after the patient was resuscitated, he spluttered out of his code and he pointed his finger and he said, that nurse with the beard injected something into my IV and it made me stop breathing.
Wow.
That's when they started the investigation. And sometimes it's patients' families where they'll say, our family member, you know, our grandmother was fine when we left her. 20 minutes later, we came in, the nurse was mopping her brow and said, I'm so sorry, but she's passed.
Oh my God.
So it's a variety of ways.
And yeah, and so at the night shift when not as many people are around, and you had the story of the one nurse who was, I think you said that this, I don't know if it's all hospitals, but at least at this hospital, security would go to the cardiac arrest, and she was dating the security guard. So they were operating together on the night shift, that she would drug him or kill him and he would, I don't know, sign off on the report or whatever they do. And
well, this is the Kristen Gilbert case in Massachusetts, and it was a Veterans Administration hospital which involved the federal government in this prosecution. And what they noticed is that patients would have codes not only when she was at work, but only when she and her paramour, who was a security guard, were both at work. And she was doing this for the drama. So security would have to come to the code, and you know, some of the witnesses said that she was very dramatic. And
so she liked the thrill or excitement, the way that they say the firefighters who get a kick out of, you know, set the fires so that they can put them out or something like that kind of thing.
Yes, that's one of the motives and one of the dynamics is that these people like to create crises. One of the nurses, even in his confession, he said, I'm like the volunteer firefighters who set fires. And he said, I'm doing it because of the respect and admiration I get from my peers because I'm so good in a code. Now, some of the others, it's just sadistic motives. Some, in Indiana, the Orville Lynn Majors case, the nurses noticed that if a patient was particularly whiny or complaining, that those were the patients that would die.
When I read that, I thought it was like a sick joke in a way, you know, because I think you said that the colleagues were, the one was afraid to go to lunch.
Yes.
Because she noticed that the patients tended to die if she went to lunch and were left with the other nurse.
That's right. That's right. And the nurses were reporting this to administration. And one of the awful things about some of these cases, and in the Indiana case, the prosecutor said to me, the people who've obstructed justice the most are the doctors and the administrators, because they know the hospital will look bad when we get all this data and see that they should have stopped it.
And by the way, I do want to say that it is nurses most of the time. That's the #1 profession.
85%.
85%.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, male nurses are disproportionately at fault.
They are. Only 7% of nurses are male, although that's changing dramatically. In nursing schools now, up to 25% of the students are male.
I'm starting to think that's a bad idea, by the way, now that when I hear your statistics. But okay, 7%.
But so 7% practicing, but 40% of the convicted nurses are men. So some of this could be gender bias.
Wow.
You know, they sometimes...
Okay, I'm a guy, but I don't want a male nurse when I go to the hospital.
Well, yeah, you do. And I should point out to the public that this is so rare. We think it's less than 1 in 2 million healthcare providers, okay?
So we're talking, what, hundreds of millions of hospital, or tens of millions of hospital patients a year?
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly. The reason that we publish this is that we want people to understand that it is worth investing resources to have a little bit better security. Think of all the resources we've put into airport security, and you compare that to the number of deaths caused by breaches in airport security. And the number of deaths is well over 2,000, and we believe that it would be good to have pharmaceutical tracking, it would be good to have also personnel tracking, and that it would be good for hospitals to give honest references when they have a nurse who's been fired because patients have been dying or having codes.
So that's how they get rid of, they deal with the problem. They just fire them, or they just, and then they go off to another hospital and set up shop again. And
exactly.
Wow, that is.
And hospitals right now tend to only give the information that, yes, this nurse was an employee in this hospital on these dates. And they won't say that they were fired because they're afraid of getting sued for giving a bad reference. But we're saying to them, that is so much less of a risk than the risk of not giving an accurate reference if the nurse has been fired because patients were dying.
Well, yeah, and again, what I just find fascinating, again, is that, you know, you're working with somebody and you think something's going wrong, and then, but how you deal with it, because on the one hand, you have to have proof, which means they have to kill more people, in effect.
Right. Right. Now, I do want to talk about a model case, and the hospital was superb in Albany, Georgia, where they knew that they had patients having suspicious codes on the evening shift. So they tracked the data. They pretty much knew that and they also knew the patients had had overdoses of potassium chloride. So first, they locked up all the potassium chloride, which is a common medication, usually sort of freely on the nursing unit, so they counted every dose. And all of a sudden, the increase in codes went back down to normal. So then when they kind of knew which nurse had been present at almost all of the codes, then they went ahead and said, okay, potassium is available again. The very next code that happened, they resuscitated the patient. They immediately linked her to tubing that was just riddled with potassium chloride, and she confessed.
Wow.
So they did a super job. The epidemic only lasted 3 months, and they were able to stop her, and they didn't do a witch hunt. They didn't, you know, have all the negative publicity where they were making all the nurses freaked out and that kind of thing. They really nailed it well.
We'll be right back. We're back with Bea Yorker today talking about hospital serial killers, doctors and nurses who kill their patients. So a good case was 3 months they were able to shut the person down.
Yes.
So
yes.
Even that, again, it's kind of scary to think they're out there operating for that long. But again, as you said, I mean, what can you do? You can't, you have to have proof, they have rights. I mean, they can sue the hospital. So,
well, there are some stopgap measures. For example, in some of the cases, their licenses have been revoked. So even if, like in the case of the one that was millions of dollars of wrongful death, that nurse's license was revoked. So while she's not incarcerated, she's able to work. I understand that actually she's doing legal consulting.
For accused, I don't know.
But she's not taking care of patients anymore.
Well, and the other problem is, okay, so it's mostly nurses, but it's also doctors. I think doctors are the next
Yes.
smaller category.
Yes.
And so as you said, though, as far as tracking medications, I'm assuming they have basically unlimited access to anything they want in the hospital.
They
pretty
do.
much.
They do. The reason it's probably less physicians is because they only round on the patients usually once a day, maybe twice a day. They have less
So
access.
the patients aren't as annoying to them.
Well, and they just don't have as much time.
Right.
Whereas the nurses are with patients 24/7. They are
More
there round the
opportunity,
clock,
more-
much more opportunity. And these days, when a lot of medications are delivered through an intravenous tube, you don't even have to break the patient's skin to inject them. You can just inject a little teeny tiny bit more medicine than what is therapeutic into their IV line, and they won't even know it.
Well, and that's the thing. The doctors and nurses know what'll do the job.
They do, yes.
I mean, they're trained in it, and
and
they
they
also
study
know.
it, you know, like most of the nurses and doctors deny that they've done anything wrong. But the few that have confessed, they'll say that part of it was just the power and control of being able to know exactly how much medicine it would take to cause a heart attack but not kill the person.
Wow. So you think there could be people at the fringe? Again, you've been talking about serial killers. I emailed you earlier about the Bulgarian nurses who were accused of injecting the patients with AIDS, and of course, I guess some of them died. But there could be an issue possibly with people even just making patients sick, but not actually killing them. I mean, do you
Yes.
think that's another dimension to this that maybe hasn't been explored as well, or?
Oh, I hate to even think that, but it would make sense that sometimes patients just get sick and don't die, and that may never, ever be caught to anybody's attention.
And that might even be more common because let's say you piss the nurse off, and so she put, you know what I mean? And she knows she's not going to kill you, but she just wants to,
Make you miserable.
make you throw up or something, and so there could be
Yeah.
other opportunities for. And the thing is too, a lot of the medication, as you said, either because of things that happen in the body or after death, or it can be hard to track it.
It can be very hard to track because we don't routinely do studies on a patient after they have died for toxicology. We usually do it at the time of death or at the time they have a cardiac arrest. And some of the patients who've been victims, their bodies were exhumed, dug out of the grave, months to years after their death, and then we have no comparison studies to know what the toxicology would look like.
Well, so you're in the final few minutes or moments, what would be your advice for really what hospitals and nurses, because again, I think there is, I can just see it, or I would think it's true that there is the tendency with so many, with the police and the firemen or whatever, to sweep it under the rug. They don't want bad publicity, they don't want to get sued. So how do you change that kind of mentality to, just get them out of here and go to another hospital, to, being a little more proactive? And the airline pilots had the same kind of thing where they didn't want the computers in the cockpits to track all the movements, even though it lowered the accident rate, but they didn't want to they were afraid to get in trouble.
Yeah.
So you have, in other words, people don't want Big Brother looking over their shoulder, but yet.
Well, that's what the study hopes to prove, is that it's a big enough problem that it is worth it for hospitals to take the time to do better surveillance. We'd like to pass laws that give them immunity if they give a bad reference on a nurse. If they say, no, this nurse was hired or fired, we have a do not rehire in their file, you should not hire them. And then they'd have immunity if they were sued for that, although if they're telling the truth, basically that's a good defense to that kind of a libel or slander suit. And we want to encourage hospitals to track drugs and medications, even if they're not narcotics, just the routine drugs, because if they're given in a toxic dose, that can kill a patient as well.
Yeah, and then you have the whole issue too of accidents or malpractice, let alone intentional.
Right.
So,
that's right.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. Bea
Thank
Yorker,
you.
Dean of Health and Human Services Colleges at Cal State LA, talking about serial killers in hospitals. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next time.